Okay, in this tutorial, I'm just going to cover quickly how to export an Uber camera from the promising yet lacking camera sequencer in Maya, and then do a quick overview of the render settings to output a little render of an animation here that I've created. Let's go ahead and play this. So we have a little boxy character that we're using in class. And we just switch between two different cameras in this shot, or in this little clip. So we're using this main camera, and then back to undercam, and then to main cam. And so when we set up the render settings, we're using Arnold, and Arnold, especially because the render sequence is not as feature rich for when you don't have it embedded within a render manager, excuse me, or something else like that. So what we're going to do is cheat a little bit. We're going to use Maya's Uber camera that it will generate for you. This certainly could be more robust in the future, but fingers crossed. So we have the sequencer here, and just down at the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and just choose Uber camera. And when I choose this, probably will not see anything other than the fact that Uber camera now shows up in the outliner. Now, in using this in class, I've seen actually two errors. One error is something that when a camera maybe accidentally gets scaled or something, it says that camera 2 or camera 3 has a scale on the transform, and therefore it won't create the Uber camera. I think this is actually a bug. I did look into this, and there were a few students that had cameras that the scale had been changed, which you really don't need to do for a camera. And in fixing the scaling, sometimes it would fix this error that Maya would give, other times it would not. This other kind of hacks to fix that were a little more complicated than I can explain here in the tutorial. So if you're one of my students and you see that issue, email me and I will fix that for you. More common issue would be is if you had stretched your shot sequence here so that it was a certain percentage, right, and other than 100, and Maya will kind of screw that up, and it won't be able to export this Uber camera based on the scaling. So when you do this, you need to be really careful that this says 100%, and then these little numbers here, you can see 16 and 16. This just tells us how many frames are in each shot, and the other ones here like 46 and 46 or 28 and 28. So make sure that those are exactly the same, because based on the percentages and the fact that when I scale this, it will tell me that it's 90 some odd percent. It won't get me like 101 or something. So if you have a long range of frames and you're off just by one, Maya might not show that as 99%, but the ratio, the 16 to 16, this needs to be even on the number of frames. So that might be another reason we were having some issues in class. So anyways, I have created an Uber camera, which I'm very excited about. So just double click and get that out of the way. And then we can see in the Uber camera, if I make that the view, now as I scrub through the timeline, it switches these cameras, but it's really not shifting the cameras. It has now animated this camera so that it moves from place to place. So if I go into the graph editor and I select Uber camera, we can see here that it moves across and then changes to the new keyframes here and then moves to the other. And if for some of you this graph editor might look similar, and others this might look different, this is kind of the modern UI. It's the same thing. Maya's just trying to get fancy with how it identifies what the keyframes look like. Okay, so we don't need that anymore. We have the graph editor. Down here we have our animation. So how do we go about rendering this out? So let's go up to the render settings, and in the common tab, again, this is probably the most important part. It's certainly the most boring, but it's the most important part, is that we make sure that we know where the images are going to go, and hopefully you've identified a project that you're using. So if this says something that doesn't look familiar to you, I would say as far as the directory that I'm looking at right here, right? So right now it says Dane Documents Maya Projects Default Images. So it's going to save it into this image folder, and it's going to name it Boxy Flip, which we've done right here. And because I've changed these settings down here, it's going to go from 1 to 10. Just because that's what I set it up to be, right? So and this was the example that we did in class. All right, so let's leave that there. And if I go up to File, under the Project, I can do Set Project. So right now, because we haven't been changing this should already be set to that location. But just in case it wasn't, I might come in here and just click on Default and set that to be the default project setup. So that's where those files are going to get saved, right? And it's important that you can find the movies, or the images, so that we can turn it into a movie clip in class next Tuesday. Okay, so we're going to leave it at EXR. We've changed this to name, number, and extension. So the default will just be to do a single frame, right? And as a single frame, frame padding and the start and end frame are grayed out, because we're not doing a range, right? And we don't need frame padding for the numbering sequence. But once we go to name, number, and extension, this just has to do with how the editing program will be able to sequence these images. So name, number, extension is going to work perfect for us. In the class, we had the start and end frame at just 1 to 10, because that's the default. I'm going to go ahead and say 90 is going to be the end of my animation. So if I look at this, it kind of settles around frame 80, but I want to, and this is kind of a waste, but it's just such a short animation. I'm going to go ahead and render the last 10 frames, so it kind of pauses there. Didn't want to just end it right, exactly as it landed there. I could certainly, in the editing program, duplicate and stretch out that frame and whatever, so this saves some render time, but that's what I'm going to do for this. The Arnold rendering. All right, so in class, I think we had the 6, 2, and 2 set up. And again, these rays work differently for noise that might appear in the render based on lights, material qualities, the amount of indirect versus direct light. I have turned on both depth of field and motion blur because I'm an old camera hound, so I like these kind of features in there. So what I'm going to do is turn down the diffuse quality. So instead of trying to maximize the quality samples for these attributes here, I'm just going to turn up, in fact, let's try to pull this down a little bit. So by turning these down, since I'm going to use this Uber sample right here, the camera AA, I don't want to do as many, I don't want to basically turn everything up to, high quality. I'm going to turn these down and use this one. And the reason why is because the camera AA eliminates noise for depth of field and motion blur, right? So since this is going to do most of the quality, I don't need extra quality on top of it. If you're confused by this, and again, we're just rendering in here, I would try something. So if you're using no motion blur, I would use something like 622 or maybe 722, okay, for the samples. If you are going to use a heavy depth of field and motion blur, or one or the other, and you do little test renders and you notice that it's grainy, you might go with this setting, this 10-1-1. And again, this is, I've just did little render tests, and based on the speed of what I was getting, I got better quality quicker with this setting. That might change in various scenes, right? It totally depends on what the lighting conditions and all these other factors. So anyways, just don't do this, right? This will explode your machine and it will not give you, look at that, 20,000. Okay, that would be bad, right? So, okay. So if you're using depth of field and motion blur, maybe this. If you're not using that, something like this, okay? Okay, I did turn on motion blur down here. I enabled it, right? And in class, we did turn on the clamping. This is my own personal preference. So we'll leave that where it's at. So let's go back and just double check our settings. Double check our settings. So it's going in the right direction, right directory. We have the number of frames. But I have not selected a camera, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and select Uber camera as my rendering camera. And then I'll close this. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and do a render. And earlier I was using the FX menu. So remember we have modeling and rigging and animation in here, and we also have rendering. So I'm going to change that kind of sub-menu context so that I get a new set of menus here, and then underneath render, I get the render sequence. And this is what Arnold does for its animations, right? At least what we will use. I'm going to choose the option just because I do not trust anything. So the current camera, it says, is perspective. That is not what I want to render through. I want the Uber camera, right? Okay. And then I should just be able to click render sequence, right? And this is just going to go, but you can see as I click in here, it's a little slow. In fact, I don't even know if it will let me. So it's just based on the size of that window, it's going to go ahead and render, but it is doing it kind of small, right? So what I'm going to do is hit escape. Oh yeah, actually, I just forgot this. So on Windows, if you hit escape, it will quit the render. If I hit escape on Mac, way to go, Maya. It's a bug. It will not work. Right? I wonder if I just, yeah, so it's just locked out, right? So I'm going to have to force quit Maya to get that to work. So if you're rendering at home, make sure, the other thing I should have maybe mentioned that I did not do because I'm in tutorial mode is it's a good idea once you get those settings before you do the render sequence, go ahead and hit, go ahead and save the file so that you have that. So if you've done all that work and like me, you're on a Mac and you're going to have to force quit the entire application to get it to do what I want, you don't lose everything, right? So here I'm kind of, it's just going to go. The window here was kind of set up small. This is actually Maya's render view window. Even though it looks tiny in here in the render, that does not mean that that's how tiny it's going to be. In fact, when this renders, we'll let this go through again really quick. And so this is going to flash some info on the screen. What you will see is the true resolution that we had before, the 960 by 540. We'll just wait here for a second. So it says that, and then it said zoom. It was kind of hard to see. It was 0.481. So that's just how much it was zoomed in. That doesn't mean that the image is really that small. Last thing I should say is if you do want motion blur, go ahead and render with it. That's fine. But just know that when the camera cuts to those individual shots, basically UberCam moves to the location of each one of the edited camera views. The motion blur is going to be worthless for one frame. Right? So, but don't worry about that. It's just one frame out of 24. So what we'll do is just delete that bad frame and we'll import individual sequences together and put those together in After Effects, which will be very easy. It's not a problem at all. So if you want to do motion blur, go for it. That's totally fine. But when it gets to that change, if you see one frame that totally looks just like it's scrambled visually, don't worry about it. Let it render one more frame and you'll see that it has settled down, right? Okay, 13 minutes. Man, it was a little longer than I thought I was going to do. You can see now that my epoxy has started to do the jump that the motion blur is taking hold here. So, and this is why I turned up the settings, is I wanted, really good kind of motion blur in there. Anyways, all right. I hope that helps.